May I welcome you back. Hello to the online followers and the participants of our conference. I'm glad that you are back with us. This is the official session dedicated to the 100th anniversary of birth of John Paul II. We would like to remember him, his thoughts, and what he strove for. John Paul II about Europe, the reunification of Europe, and the unification of spirit. Valentina Alazraki has been invited to this panel, a journalist from TV News Dzisiero, Professor Rocco Buttiglione, a professor at the Institute of Philosophy, Edith Stein, Dr. Hans-Gert Pöttering, the plenipotentiary with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for European Affairs, a former president of the European Parliament, and the former head of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Also, we've invited Archbishop Grzegorz Ryś, Professor Miloš Lišner, the president of the European Association of Catholic Theologians. Father Lišner will be with us online. Also, and it's an honor to have her with us, we have with us Madam Volha Kowalkova from the Belarusian Coordination Council. We are happy to have here with us. She represents the Belarusian opposition. This discussion wouldn't be possible today without hearing a voice of Belarus. For us, the organizers of this conference, it is important to show solidarity with Belarus in those difficult times. Father Sova has been asked to moderate this discussion, a journalist and a publicist. Thank you very much. Welcome to everybody. Welcome to this session and this discussion. In a manner of speaking, it is the closing session of this conference and is a gesture because we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the birth of John Paul II. We are talking about Europe, its integration, its identity, and the changes that have happened there too in the last decades. This process cannot be looked at without it taking into account the impact John Paul II on it. Just as we heard some time ago, the Pope arrived in Vatican in 1978, and by default he became the first Pole in the European Union. Well, a bit of a joke, but not entirely. So we know how huge a role John Paul II played in this change that took place, both when it comes to identity and culture, but also on this political level. In our discussion today, we would like us to think about those milestones and road signs that John Paul II left for us in our thinking about Europe. I would like to begin with what Valentina Alazraki is going to say. She can be with us. Unfortunately, she couldn't also be online live, so she recorded her address. She is not here by accident, just like all the other guests. Her career as a journalist, the beginning of it, is linked to 1978. She arrived in Vatican under the pontificate of Paul VI, and she was a correspondent of various Mexican media. I spoke to her before the conference, and I asked her to share with us some reflections on the Pope's pontificate, because she observed it as a journalist, as a woman, as a Christian, who arrived in Europe from a different cultural sphere, and she looked at what was happening in Europe through a certain prism, through the prism of the teaching and the pontificate of the Polish Pope. And I believe that it's going to be an interesting presentation for you. Welcome, everybody. First, thank you for having invited me. I'm happy that I can participate in this meeting. Because of work and because of a pandemic, I'm physically far away from you. I've been asked to talk about my own experience from the point of view of a woman, a Mexican woman, and a Latino. Well, what about my experience of John Paul II, professional experience, mostly? Well, it was something that was absolutely one of a kind, unique and unforgettable for me. Together with my colleagues, I followed what this extraordinary man was doing, and through his travels he shaped history. That's what he did. He traveled across the world and he shaped history, and we were witnesses to that. I'm fortunate because I'm a Mexican, and John Paul II began his pontificate by traveling to Mexico. And he told me later that this is what made it possible for him to understand what kind of a pope he wanted to be, and he wanted to be an itinerant pope, because millions of people, Catholics, would never be able to arrive in Vatican. So he arrived in Mexico. It was a love of first sight on both parts, so this love was reciprocated. This love lives on in Mexico, in Latin America. He is our Pope. He is a Mexican Pope, a South American Pope, broadly speaking. Latin America is a continent that John Paul II crisscrossed, visited all of them, some of them, many a time, and this is a continent of hope because over half of Catholics live there. Mexico also played an important role. His visit to this country opened the door to visiting Poland for him. Mexico was a lay country and had no diplomatic relationship with Vatican, and yet John Paul II was invited to attend a conference of bishops there. So the authorities basically were not terribly happy to invite the Pope there because they expected what it might turn into. And this is why the Polish authorities were actually forced to invite him. I remember 1978, I believe it was the Square of Victory, millions of people present there raising the cross, and John Paul II speaking about hope and about how the Spirit should descend and fill the Polish nation. I could sense that something was happening there, something was changing. 10 years ago, I witnessed the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and I understood that we had witnessed 10 years before that the first brick being taken away from this wall. So I accompanied the Pope on 100 out of his 104 journeys. Undescribable experience. I do not believe I would be ever able to experience anything similar to that. The Pope began his pontificate in Latin America, and he understood this continent very well. He arrived there being accompanied by this Virgin Mary of Guadalupe, and he understood the spirituality and religiosity, folk religiosity. That was a deep kind of religiosity, and that is why he has been, continues to be so deeply beloved by the people there. And he would shake hands by various dictators from the left and from the right, but he would also always meet people that opposed those dictators. All these journeys had a single goal: to strengthen, on the one hand, the local church, so that local Catholic communities got stronger, so that the living conditions could improve. On the other hand, it was about supporting certain democratic changes or initiating those. Undoubtedly, in our continent, the Pope managed to bring down rather many a wall, and he helped us to understand what the social teaching of the Church is all about, what his teaching is all about. He met Mexican workers and farmers and indigenous peoples there, and we could see how sensitive he was to social justice. And we heard that nobody should be excluded. It was very important for Latin America. Surely the years he spent under the communist regime in Poland meant that the theology of liberation was difficult to accept for him. Politics and faith could not be reconciled. First and foremost, because he believed that the church had many tools to help the poor and to fight for social justice without any political involvement, especially on the left-hand side of the political spectrum. And his visits there, they are still remembered, largely because he acted as a broker. There was this dispute between Chile and Argentina, and he helped to avoid a war there. The last country that he visited was Cuba. The leaders didn't want John Paul II to visit that country. Probably they were afraid that a scenario similar to that to the Polish one could unfold. The results were somewhat different, but for sure it was a historical journey. We could see Castro sitting in the first row together with Mr. Marquez. These are truly unforgettable moments, and unforgettable were the words that started this long process. The world should open up to Cuba, and Cuba should open up to the world. And thanks to this journey, we set out on this journey to improve the well-being of the church and the faithful there. So this joint journey was an unforgettable experience for me. So I've also been asked to say certain things as a woman. For me, it was a beautiful experience. When his pontificate started, I was 23 years old. What struck me in this man was how clear and pure his look was when he was looking at women. You could see that he loved women as humans. When he was looking at women, it was similar to him admiring a beautiful sunset or flowers. You could see that when he went to Africa. He was offered gifts by young girls, half naked, as is the custom over there. They were only clad in straw skirts, and we around him felt somewhat embarrassed, and he simply looked at those girls the way he would be looking at beautiful flowers. And that showed his inner purity. It always struck me how pure he was. And there was this letter that he wrote to women, and he wrote about our dignity and the role that we play as mothers and members of communities. I believe that he was, to a certain extent, a feminist pope. There were only 2 women in his team that traveled with him, and he would always give us special treatment and give us huge respect. Let me add something here. My professional experience is really unique there, but what moved me the most and struck me the most was that I could accompany him in the last years of his life in the way of a cross. You could understand that his great inner strength was not linked to the external, to his charisma, to those physical gifts that were bestowed on him, such as his smile. It was all linked to the interior, and on the inside was his faith in God, which was really impressive. And you had to understand this interior, and he could show us all that was happening with him and to him, all this suffering, and we could see the price that he paid to be able to stay with people. It was an unforgettable experience. It was a lesson. We saw him carrying the cross till the last days and last moments of his life, and he showed himself for a few seconds sometime before his death. And he gave extra dignity to those who suffer, to the elderly who are often seen as no longer needed in the society. So it was an important lesson that he taught us, and it is especially important for me. Thank you for your invitation, and thank you for remembering him. So it was a memory and a message. She helped us to look at the Pope's pontificate, the Pope that is European and Polish, from a broader perspective. And at times we forget that the role of the Pope was not limited only to his country and to his continent. This role was very broad indeed. So the impact of the Pope's thought will be discussed in various contexts now. But first, I would like to ask a question to President Dr. Hans-Gert Pöttering, because yesterday you talked about the role played in the world of the European transformations. The Berlin Wall was collapsing, Germany got united, and we knew, and the Christians knew that it was possible largely because the Pope was Polish and he had a huge impact on the world back then. Mr. President, you looked at the Pope as the head of the Church, but also as an engine pushing us for change. What's your point of view and your perspective here? What is the balance when it comes to the impact that Pope had when it comes to the change of thinking among the European politicians?
Thank you very much. Yes, so impressive words we heard from the Mexican journalist. We Catholics, yes, we always believe that after the conclave, or whenever the new Pope is chosen, this is the action of the Holy Spirit. I think with the choice of Karol Wojtyła, the influence of the Holy Spirit was so strong. Such a man from Poland elected to be Pope, 1978. This was something that was difficult to imagine, or had been difficult to imagine before that date. And Karol Wojtyła, a charismatic man, as we heard earlier from the journalist, with this purity, internal purity and the radiance. I think he was the right person at the right time. And it was very clear from the very beginning, especially after I heard the words of the journalist, that the Pope was critical with regard to the liberation theology in Latin America. But in Europe, he was a big person who brought freedom to Europe. This might seem to be a contradiction in terms, but this was something very special, unique, that the Pope, Karol Wojtyła, was a big patriot, a Pole. At the same time, he was a European. Let us remember about that. A Polish patriot, but at the same time, a European patriot. For the Church, obviously, he was very much oriented towards the whole world, focused on the world, globally. His great influence, especially starting in Poland here, if he didn't have this big influence on the whole nation, the changes would not have been possible. I've read words of John Paul II here, his book, Identity, on identity, his identity, where he speaks about his influences and also influences on him, on Polish patriotism, European spirit and global approach. They were brought together in his personality. Jerzy Popiełuszko, also Jerzy Popiełuszka, Polish priest, martyr. I read a book on him, and his secretary, Pope's secretary, Stanisław Dziwisz, who became later Metropolitan of Krakow. And he was witness to discussions between Lech Wałęsa and John Paul II in the Tatra Mountains when they met in Poland. And John Paul II to Wałęsa said, "I'm praying for you." And this prayer, the prayer of the Pope for Lech Wałęsa, this was an expression of very deep solidarity, and also solidarity with the whole solidarity movement in Poland. And for Lech Wałęsa, of course, it was very important for the whole solidarity movement. This has given them power, given them courage to continue their fight for freedom, for human dignity. Towards the end, concluding, I would like to say that also the unity of my homeland, the freedom of Germany, would not have happened without the solidarity movement. This shows how clearly we are united in our values. Poland and Germany, we are united in all European countries. For this reason, we should work together. All countries, I stress, all countries of Europe should be working together. We are part of one bigger unity. We, Poles, Germans, French, we are part of United Europe and one church. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to ask an additional question. You were an active politician when Europe was still divided at that time. Even this visible symbol, the Berlin Wall, but it was there, but it was divided by the political ideas as well. Did you have this impression at the beginning that the pontificate of John Paul II will bring about change in Europe? This will be something special, something new. It was someone from behind the Iron Curtain appearing in Western Europe, but I think there was more to it. Yes, of course. Well, once the election was made in 1978, it was not clear from the very beginning how big the consequences would be and the whole freedom movement, how significant it would be. But yes, the Pope poll, this was something unimaginable. We had a series of Italian popes for centuries. Unbelievable how the Italians were able to make it, and then the Holy Spirit, of course, also confirmed in this choice always of Italian popes. But after centuries of Italian popes, we had suddenly changed and a new Polish pope. So a Pole, Peter's seat in the Vatican, it was something unimaginable for us at that time. But of course, from the very beginning, it was not clear that the political changes in Europe would be so significant. But later, with time, with the different visits also to Poland of the Pope, it became more and more clear that such changes were on the cards. So this is the way in which we have seen those changes. At the beginning, we didn't know. Well, of course, the dictatorial systems of Hitler and Stalin, at the beginning, they brought people together. But as we know from history, hundreds, thousands of people coming together to take part in the spiritual meetings of the Pope. It was something unique. Can I perhaps move now to our next guest? Reverend Professor Miloš Lichner from Slovakia is also with us, President of the European Society for Catholic Theology. Thank you for being with us online. I understand you are not able to be here in Krakow because of the limitations, also the current difficult situation in Slovakia. The current situation is not easy. Professor, can I ask you a few questions? First of all, do you think that this theory of the Pope about two lungs of Europe, breathing with the Eastern and the Western lung, when he visited especially Eastern Europe, he spoke in Poland, but also we heard similar comments during his first visit to Czechoslovakia at that time, in Velehrad. He spoke about also Cyril and Methodius and the tradition of Eastern Christianity in Central Europe. There was also a time of integration, political integration of Western and Central Eastern Europe, the enlargement, new countries joining the European Union. And this theory perhaps of those two lungs of Europe that are needed to breathe, the Eastern and the Western, maybe we have forgotten about it a little bit. Can we still say that this theory of Eastern and Western Christianity, the two lungs for Europe, can it still help us generate our way of thinking, our approach to Europe?
So at first, good afternoon to everybody, and from Bratislava, let me at first express my thanks for this invitation, and I also thanks for this question, which is quite complex. So I was thinking on this question as also on the topic of the conference through the history of the early church, which is my specialization. So there are many similarities between our times and the times of the early church fathers. And we can read our present history through our past, which can be, I'm sure, quite helpful. Let's just briefly remind the migration crisis at the time of the Emperor Theodosius and in our times. Plague epidemic in Rome during the life of Saint Pope Gregory the Great and our COVID epidemic. Fake news during the life of Saint Martin of Tours about the war and our fake news. And the plans of Leo the Great, the Pope, to establish a European Christian unity. As we say in Latin, nihil novi sub sole, there is nothing new under the sky. So, everybody knows the famous sentence we just mentioned of Saint John Paul II about the two lungs of Europe. At the conference here in eastern part of Europe, and the fact that I, as the president of European Society for Catholic Theology, I'm also from eastern part, can confirm this. I consider the year of 1978, when John Paul II became a Roman bishop, as a crucial turning point for the history of Central and Eastern Europe. We know that since the beginning of his pontificate, he sought to encourage the cause of greater European unity. By the way, this we find also in the works of Saint Leo the Great and Saint Gregory the Great and others. Concern of John Paul II for the continent future were primarily spiritual, and he thought the Council of European Bishops' Conferences should play a leading part in re-evangelization of Europe. So I think that his idea of Europe is in strong lines with the previous papal teaching, underlying the necessity of spiritual background of Europe. And also, Emerite Pope Benedict XVI, is also actual Pope Francis, mainly in his Fratelli Tutti, underline the same necessity of the spiritual conversions of Catholics in whole Europe. So, but we find also some differences between Saint John Paul II and Benedict. John Paul II's vision, European vision, was more centered on Europe itself. Ratzinger was sure that in globalized world we can think on Europe also in context of global challenges. And the same does also Pope Francis. But symptomatic is that the Pope John Paul II kept, beside of many disappointments, the fundamental European optimism, a hope. Ratzinger, at the beginning of the years 90s, admitted the fact that European culture can disappear. I think that John Paul II came to Rome with the conviction that the Church in the East and West can have a future when she put away resignation and fear and opened the door to Christ. And this said Pope Francis in his last encyclic. There are forces which misuse of fear in order to dominate people, as we know from the history. So, his vision was that Europe was born from Christianity, which gave to the European civilization a form, an identity, and represent a real criterion of to be European and the source of the unity of European nations. John Paul II said in his article about the borders of Europe that if the real source of to be European is a Christianity, then the borders of Europe are the borders of the penetration of the gospel and also the borders of the protection against invasions from other places, which desire to change this European's political and cultural profile. These are his thinking. So let's back to your questions about two lungs. So they are still these two lungs in Europe, and I think that I will be right interpreting his thinking as also the thinking of the actual Pope, that everything will be restarted with the spiritual conversions of every of us. So that's I can say from my side.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for showing this perspective, because you also referred to the fathers of the church. You spoke about this century-long tradition about the thinking of the teaching of the church, and reference to John Paul II, but also to Benedict XVI and Francis. Thank you very much for reminding us this heritage, century-long heritage that you referred to. As we speak about Europe and our European experience, our laureate of the In Veritate Award, Rocco Buttiglione, is here with us. He still is very much active participant of public life, and I'm delighted to be able to give the floor to Professor Buttiglione in a moment. I would like him to share his experiences with us about what cultural identity of Europe today is in the world that is changing, ever-changing world. Many of the dogmas of yesterday that seem to be obvious, many of them today are considered by some, perhaps some political groups, social groups, also for some new religious groups, perhaps they consider them as an obstacle. Professor, can I address the next question to you? We of us, should we fight for our joint European identity? Or should we perhaps simply agree that the identity is changing and enter into dialogue with those new ideas and new groups that come and are perhaps stronger and stronger represented in Europe?
Schauen Sie mal, wir müssen vorerst die Frage stellen, was
Well, I think that we have to start off with the following question.
die Intention, die Absicht von Johannes Paul II.
What are the different intentions governing the work of John Paul II? If we want to understand them well, I think it's worth quoting Pope Francis. He said in one of his documents that we should not be focused on occupying room in space, but we should focus on launching certain processes. When he spoke about defending a Christian character of Europe, he started saying, yes, Europe has Christian origins, and some believe that we have to defend it against all enemies. We must occupy certain spaces to fight against those migrating to Europe, for instance, or we have to defend our heritage against other cultures. But this was not the mentality, very clearly, of John Paul II. He wanted to focus on something else. He wanted to launch actions and processes, and this is exactly what he did in Poland, in Europe, in the world around us. And how is it possible, actually, to launch initiatives, to bring into life different actions? And in his view, it was clear that you had to start with God. The Holy Spirit, the soul of John Paul II can be found in Redemptor Hominis, in basically two words. God and Jesus Christ has presented himself through Jesus Christ, and also in this way he has presented to us truth about human beings. This is the truth, that human being is a person, an identity, which is able to accept other persons, other individuals, were to become one through this interaction. So an individual, one person that has certainly the right to be free, but at the same time this person is part of a larger community that is being created. And one's completeness can be only found through this interaction with others, completeness. This was John Paul II spoke. Person as a subject, he wrote, and then he referred to the person and in the relationship to a community, to a bigger whole. I'm not able to know who I am. I will never realize who I am if I am not part of a larger relationship with my wife, my children, my parish and parish community, my friends, people at work I meet, with the whole community I live in. So one's identity is being created through relationships, individuality through a larger communion with others. This was very clearly stated and stressed by him. Again, he spoke very much for strengthening the rights of the family. In the family, we learn how to live in a community. This is very important. But he also spoke about other dimensions, other communities, the community of the nation, and he spoke also about the community of the world of workers, people working together, so colleagues at work, and the community of people working together. And he sent a very clear message whenever he was in Poland. He said that you are not individuals when he spoke to people listening to him, but he stressed the dimension of the nation. You are one nation. He asked people to not fear, to be brave. Remember that people are part of a larger community of the nation, focusing also about the future. You have to take over and accept responsibility for your future as the nation. And this, of course, referred not only to the Christians. This is something natural for everyone within a nation. And it's very easy. We very easily forget about this dimension, that we are part of a larger community of the nation. And he often sent this message that we have to remember about this dimension very well. Can I add, Professor, another question to that? You spoke about this personalism of Wojtyła, focus on an individual, on family. You spoke about work, labor also, and its importance. But if we had a look chronologically also at the main subjects that John Paul II considered important, culture was one of them, certainly.
There you are. This is yet another step. However, let us stay with his first pilgrimage to Poland. My first time in Poland was, I believe, 45 years ago. I can still remember that Poland. What struck me was that there was no trust to other people. Do not talk to this man. These people are agents. They are suspect. They could be special services people. Naturally, they were not, but there were quite a lot of those in the population. And suddenly you see somebody like Karol Wojtyła appear, a pope, and he speaks at Plac Zwycięstwa, a victory square in Poland, and people start trusting him and trusting one another. Thus, a word created trust, a community. Father Tischner was with me at the time, and he said, "Rocco, listen, nothing will be like it was before. I do not know what's going to happen, but certainly something is going to happen." And a year later, this huge adventure of solidarity began. The word created a community. The word creates trust. He asked a question. Poland was baptized, christened, 1,000 years before. A baby was christened, in a manner of speaking. But now what we need is a confirmation. Are you ready for it, politically speaking? Are you a nation that is mature, culturally speaking? There is just one truth about the human being. Now, the weakness of the Catholic theology was that it didn't want to understand it. Metaphysics is discussed, and from it, actions are supposed to stem out of. However, for me, human anthology should be different. There is this experience that I have with my wife, with my children, my love for my community. And I need to find myself within the culture of my own nation, which is difficult at times and painful at times. And there is the strong culture of suffering here in Poland, due to various historical conditions. Now a few words about the theology of liberation in Latin America. It is not all that clear. It's not that he single-handedly condemned the theology of liberation. He said something else. He went to Puebla, and then he said that Latin America needs liberation. It should have their own theology that would use its own culture. However, Marxism cannot be a part of that, because for Marxism, humans are not anchored within their own culture. And then Ratzinger made it sound much sharper. He spoke on behalf of the congregation and he issued his first opinions. I remember, however, when I returned to the university and John Paul II invited me for lunch, or dinner, was it dinner, I believe. And he wanted me to tell him what I saw. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? He asked. And then he asked me a question about Gutierrez. There are many reasons why he should be condemned. There were many reasons not to condemn him, theological reasons, that is. But then he added, is he a good priest? What about his holy masses? Do people listen to him when he's saying rosary? Yes, by all means, Holy Father, they do. Well, he shouldn't be condemned. He needs to be talked with. And he sent Ratzinger for him to have a dialogue with Gustavo Gutierrez. Ultimately, a different theology of liberation came out of it. Jorge Marco Bergoglio was the person responsible for this folk theology, theology of culture. Yes, theology of liberation, but it was about looking at Latin America through the prism of all those people who live there and who believe so deeply and strongly. When faith becomes a human experience, the experience of a community, it's a force that can change history. But by no means is it about putting forward some kind of a model, be it capitalist or non-capitalist. What he said to the European nations was, take the fate in your own hands. You can do that, provided you remember that you are a national community. Hans Goethe, you will probably remember, was it in Berlin or in Leipzig? People were shouting, Wir sind ein Volk, we are one nation. That was an echo of that message from 1979. I believe that many theologians and active Christians in Latin America did not understand this criticism towards the theology of liberation. And I heard this argument quite often. The Pope supports the theology of liberation in Poland and in Europe because it stems from the idea of rejecting Marxism or communism, and at the same time he opposes theology of liberation that stems from care for the poor and harks back to leftist postulates. But this is by no means true. Let's go back to Gustavo Gutierrez. He accepted a proposal to hold a dialogue, and he changed his theological concepts. By the way, the book was the beginning of the whole movement. So he suggested that people should drink from other sources. He wrote what I imagined was right. The mistake was what I learned in Munich, in Louvain. Now, Grzegorz, could you reflect on our own conscience when it comes to the legacy of John Paul II and how this heritage is received here in Poland? Now, we're looking at this kind of thinking that inspired many nations in Europe and in the world. So let us make a gesture towards Golka Michalkova, who represents a young, very young generation of politicians, European politicians. Also, she represents those circles that recently, to some extent, wowed Europe with its stance. And in that stance, we see some Christian inspiration, deep Christian inspiration. So Christian involvement in the social life is not something that you can see very clearly at this point. Now, my question is going to be a cliché. What is your dream? How do you think about Europe at this point? A few years back, we saw similar political transformation in Ukraine. There you saw many European flags. What you are postulating at this point is freedom and democracy, but your flags are white and red and white. That is your own national colors. You're flying your own colors. And you're stressing that geographically and socially you are in between the European Union and Russia. So, two European worlds. Olha, what is the dream of Europe in Belarus today? Hello. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to participate in this discussion. Thank you on behalf of the Belarusian nation. What is important for us is solidarity. We've been hearing quite a lot about that. Now, elections and borders. In Belarus, it's not about the choice of the political cause. So we are united under a single goal, the right to choose our authorities. In the EU, it is something that everybody has. And this is the connecting factor that is important for us as a society. So we do not divide people. It's not about defining them according to what flag they prefer or the language they speak. What matters for us the most is that we need to be able to choose our own authorities, the power. What we can see is the Belarusian nation is a monolith. At times, you see that certain periods in the history of the world can be problematic. But let's look at the situation today. This is the age of the coronavirus, and we can see that the Belarusian society got united. When the problem hit, the authorities showed that they cannot manage, and thus the nation united, and this was the first stage of the creation of the society. People were collecting masks, giving shelter and flats to medics. This was the first difficult moment this year. Now the elections, another stage, they had quite an interesting impact. For the first time in the 26 years of our history, this mechanism worked. During the campaign, what you could hear was that you can change, you're all leaders. And thus, people begin to believe in themselves. So, for a long time, people never believed that a change is possible. But then, this faith occurred, it appeared, and led us to victory this year in Belarus. So now we see the appearance of a true European society that is taking responsibility for their own choice. Lukashenko, in those 20 odd years, did everything so that we could not participate in this decision-making process, so that we would not and did not want to participate in this process. But this year, we all believed in ourselves, and this faith led us to victory. It's not about the Christian faith, the way I see it. It's the faith that directs us. Without that faith, change would not have been possible. So the Belarusian nation is fighting, and it's about the choice. What kind of country I would like to believe in? We want a country where the law works, irrespectively of who you are. A business person, a public servant, you will be held accountable, whatever office you hold. And we want a country where the judiciary is independent. You want independent courts. And you can see that the legal framework simply doesn't work. In Europe, this legal framework works, but not in our country. And we wanted to have an international body that would look into the situation, not because we need help. It's about the fact that certain instruments do not work. We are asking for help because it's really needed. So the Belarus that I would like to live in is a country where a human being is the foundation. And the state is not hostile, but rather helps them grow, so that there are certain options for them and for their families. It's missing at this point because the authorities live apart. They live in a parallel world and they're guided only by their own interest. The nation is the power. This is the basic principle of the civic society. So, when Lukashenko is speaking, you can hear that he doesn't know what respect is. And you can see respect among those peaceful protesters that are protesting in the streets. There is some value in respecting other people, and that's what people are fighting for. They are fighting for a freedom to choose and for respect. And the main instrument of this fight is love, because nothing can overcome love. Oman uses violence, and they expect us to use the same tool in return. When we are not doing it, they are defenseless, because they don't know what to do when they see that you do not want to fight them. The violence is not there. Violence is not there, and this is very important to keep it that way. Those peaceful protests that have been happening in the last months have shown that people, are on the streets, but they are protesting peacefully. They follow the law. They are absolutely peaceful. There is even no jaywalking. It's not about when we win. We've already won. Certain processes have already been initiating in our society. They have been initiated and they are very positive. This process is irreversible. Free people cannot be re-enslaved. Lukashenko will not make it. He has no trust, he has no love, he has no support. He follows fear, he's afraid. When nobody loves you, nobody likes you, you cannot stay in power. You cannot use power. So, we have a dream of a different Belarus. We dream of Lukashenko leaving. But this is a process, and the process is ongoing. The system is broken, but it has not been broken to pieces yet, but we are supporting this process. We want the system to break down completely, and we want to build a system that would be relying on people, and that's my dream of Belarus. So this experience is truly special and unique, and we are interested in this power of the powerless, to quote Havel here. When you are in the streets and the weapon that you're wielding is your smile and love, we can see many women protesting. The older people present here might remember the debate that was taking place in Poland in the 80s. We were waiting for this voice that would strengthen us, who would give us optimism, and that voice was the voice of the Polish Pope. What kind of a voice are you waiting for from Europe at this point?
Well, after the elections, over the first 2 weeks, the voice of Europe was fairly weak. But today the position of the United Europe is very clear. Support of democratic values, and also what is very important is that Lukashenko has not been recognized as president of Belarus, elected in free elections. The support of Europe is very important for us. Today Lukashenko is not recognized in Belarus either by the European nation. So the voice of Europe is clearly heard. And secondly, solidarity, very important. I spent 2 weeks in detention. After I left detention, my colleagues from European Union sent me different publications, tweets that they were publishing at that time. This was very important for me. It's something free. Showing solidarity, writing a post, and publishing on social media. This is something that can be easily done, helping, showing, manifesting one's solidarity to those who were arrested, detained for no reason, just their political stance. What else can be done, and what kind of other support we're witnessing? Well, support for those who have been detained, arrested. Polish government is issuing humanitarian visas to Belarusians. Those visas do not make it possible for Belarusians to work in Poland, which perhaps could be changed to support those repressed in Belarus. And additionally, international pressure that we can see. There is also internal pressure from the society upwards on the political leaders, and also economic sanctions, economic pressures, sanctions that have been applied by the European Union already with regard to 40 representatives of the regime. Additionally, what Europe can also do is not to finance organizations that support those in power, those organizations that are controlled by Lukashenko. Also, I think we need better support of the civic society in Belarus. I think good cooperation between churches also could be intensified. This is important, I think, for Poles, but also for Belarusians coming to Poland, helping them also in everyday life. Many have to leave Belarus, many come to Poland, and I think they need support, just everyday help here in Poland. We do feel, yes, we are being supported. This is something important. Many of my colleagues and many of my friends have been arrested. They're in detention now. I think anything possible should be done to make them free again. Thank you very much for those words. Unification of Europe, unification of the spirit, but sometimes everyday things also matter. You just have to help people make ends meet, and those who especially have to leave their homeland. Thank you very much. Archbishop, can I give you the floor now? I'm directing the next question to Archbishop Grzegorz Ryś. Well, maybe in Poland, in our Polish church, we should think about actually what has happened after the death of John Paul II. Many things have changed. Maybe it is time to come up with a balance. Is the church just a curator of the Museum of John Paul II, or is it still trying to make us perhaps feel this burning flame of his teaching and to start something anew perhaps? What should be the role of the church? What is your perspective also as Archbishop, representative of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church in Poland? Very often in Poland things start and end at the level of bishops, if I can put it like this, at the symbolic level. If the bishop says nothing, it's as if nothing really happened. There is this very strong hierarchy of the church in Poland. What is your view? Well, I knew that the key word would be the word we. Whom do you mean by we if you say that we have done something? I will refer to your question in a moment, but if you will allow me, I would like to make one reflection. I wouldn't like to forget and skip it later. This is related to what Professor Butilione said, also our guest from Slovakia, Professor Lichner. It's about the different processes that were initiated by John Paul II, and now they keep on developing, sometimes in a surprising way. This refers to the two lungs, Fratelli Tutti, and the Pope writes about the two lungs also at the global level, the Western and the Eastern lung. But the Eastern one does not refer only to Eastern Christianity, but it can be understood also more broadly, referring to Eastern Islam, for instance. So now the question is, can Europe afford to show its experience, showing that the European experience is a big task or opportunity for the whole world? Not only Europe, but is the whole world able to breathe with two lungs? Not only the church, but is the whole world globally able to breathe with two lungs? So the reference to John Paul II, or as we heard from Professor Lichner, also going back earlier to the previous centuries, and referring also to the thought of Benedict XVI and Pope Francis. This tradition is very strong and there is this continuation. Now referring to your question, why I reacted to what you said, saying we, I think it doesn't really matter whether you are part of the hierarchy of the church or you are outside the hierarchical church, but it is my impression that your reference to we, to us, it refers also to our moderator, Priest Sova, and me, because we are almost the same age and we were in the seminar at the same time. But let me try to perhaps justify what I'm saying and say more about this dimension we, us. John Paul II, I think he spoke most about Europe between 1989, 1991, maybe 92. If you read his biography, many of his references to Europe were made at the turn of 1980s and 90s. Maybe 1991 was key. A special synod on Europe was held at that time. And what I find intriguing in what he says, he spoke about the birth of a new Europe. So John Paul II did not speak about a certain process where Eastern European countries complemented Europe or were added to New Europe. He was not saying that Europe is adding new countries, but he spoke about new Europe, a new Europe that is being born as a one Europe. Two questions can be referred to, I think, at the moment. One should be responded by us here in Poland, but the other has to be, I think, answered by our brothers and sisters on the other side of the former Iron Curtain. So, of course, my question is, to what degree am I a happier Christian, happier Pole when I can speak to Italians, Germans and French without difficulties? We are part of one community. Does it make me a different person, a different Christian, that we are closer now than we were? And I would like to know to what degree our French brothers and sisters and German brothers, do they feel richer to be able to talk to us here in Poland and other countries of Central and Eastern Europe? It's not about former Eastern countries that they had a chance to develop economically or politically or socially. in contact to Western Europe, but there are also opportunities for Western Europe, new impulses to develop in contact with former Eastern Europe. Do we want to build this Europe together? This is my understanding also in the context of the words spoken by John Paul II in 1991. And now for me personally, I listened to the words when they were presented. What was important was what he said in Częstochowa in August, the World Youth Day. He was in Częstochowa in Poland. John Paul II spoke to the young people about the need to build new Europe in 1991. I'm not sure whether other popes before John Paul II, the new popes, well, they follow in a way in the steps of John Paul II, but I think it was the first time John Paul II wanted to talk to the young people, the young generation, about such serious issues. So he asked clearly, do we want this common Europe? Do we want to be part of this big project? I was at that time as a young priest. After 3 years of priesthood, I was a young priest in Częstochowa. I went there to meet John Paul II. I took young people there, and all of us, I remember in 1991, we were all also in a way playing the role of interpreters or translators between the West and the East, because we in Poland at that time had compulsory Russian at school, so we spoke some Russian in Poland and we spoke some English at the same time. So we were a certain bridge, I remember, when young people met in Częstochowa during the World Youth Day, when we actually interpreted, helping understand people from the East. We helped them translating from English, and for those from the West, I translated from Russian. We in Poland were as if in between, speaking, understanding English and Russian at that time, at the same time. This was a role we played, not because we were so clever, but simply this was our heritage, that we learned both Russian and English at schools. And the conversation, the dialogue we had at that time, I think, is of key importance, because if you, priests, if you ask and say we, I think we have to focus on our generation, not on the older generation, our fathers, but the generation of young people in 1991 to whom the words of John Paul II were addressed. Because when we say New Europe, who should build this New Europe? In this context, I would like to draw attention to some events that play key role in my view. If we were to compare, for instance, two editions of the World Youth Day, 1991 in Częstochowa and the recent one from 2016, I think that our church, the church is completely different. Much has changed. The church is much more open, and the events of 2016, I was witness, participant, and what happened in Krakow at that time. The young people from all around the world coming here, how they were received, hosted here in Poland, how they also celebrated together in the streets. This was quite unique. It was my great pleasure, I remember, to set up an international center of evangelization. People from 50 different countries, we were coming onto the streets to bring gospel to the streets in Krakow. This was something new, real unity, community of the church, making itself visible. So I think after the World Youth Days and this part of this heritage, to refer also to the meetings of young Poles in Lednica. In 2004, 180,000 young Poles met in central Poland in Lednica, and Cardinal Huzar at that time and Cardinal Glemp, they clearly showed this sign of reconciliation between young Poles and young Ukrainians. It was witnessed by 180,000 young people in Poland. It was only later that such reconciliation was made in Warsaw, the Victory Square, where Cardinal Huzar and Archbishop Michalik came together for reconciliation between Poland and Ukraine. But the first gesture was made there in Lednica earlier. And then another very important event, a series of European youth meetings organized in Teze. We had such meetings in Poland, 5 if I'm not mistaken, 3 in Wrocław, 1 in Warsaw, 1 in Poznań, Teze meetings. Well, I myself must say that I don't really believe that there's the experience of the church among the young generation. Of course, the inspiration of John Paul II is very strong. World Youth Days, I think, would not exist without him. Lednica meetings would not be held were it not for the Pope. And as for Teze also, in Poland very much there are different opinions, of course, sometimes controversial, but I think those meetings would not again be possible without John Paul II. So going back to my previous thought, I don't really believe that there will be no fruit born by those meetings. Some of those meetings, I think, require the young to go perhaps against the mainstream, because I often spoke to young people traveling to France, also to Teze, and among some Christians, they are criticized, and Teze is criticized sometimes in Poland, and the young people going there, they have to defend those ideas if they want to bring this Teze experience to their parishes. So I think the question that you have asked, Reverend, maybe it will be answered better in 20 years. We both of us, you and me, will be able to examine our conscience and see what we have achieved. Maybe to this experience, one thing can be added. At the meeting of 7 presidents of Central and Eastern Europe, I think it was 1997 in Gniezno, meeting of Central and Eastern European presidents, very important event as well. I remember I talked to Nuncio Kowalczyk at that time, and he said that there was an idea at that time to invite Łukaszenka actually to Gniezno, to that meeting. Finally, because of political reasons, you know, obviously if there are 7 presidents, you have to have some agreement on the political at the political level. So there was a decision not to invite Łukaszenka after all. But it was, I think, quite important that we had the Gniezno meeting, very special place for Poles, and the meeting of presidents. Mr. Petering, you spoke yesterday also about this important dimension of Polish-German relations. The word reconciliation, in my view, is a very special one. Without this word, without reconciliation, it would be difficult to speak about Polish-German relations, good relations, because in public opinion polls, now in Poland, Germans are not treated not just as neighbor, but as a good neighbor. Poles treat Germans now as someone close, a good neighbor. So I think without reconciliation, without those gestures that have been made, it would not be possible to build this good relationship we have at the moment between Poland and Germany. As you know, we are present on YouTube, Facebook at the moment. Our conference is broadcast live. Also on the website of Kościół-Europa. This is the homepage of this conference. Also, the Adenauer Foundation is broadcasting our conference. I think there are many reactions from those who are following us in the different media. Can we have some information about comments and questions posed online? Yes, I do admit we've got many followers online. Maybe I will start with 2 questions to Professor Butylione. One from Dominika Żyrkowska-Gardzińska. I will read it out. Where does this wisdom of John Paul II come from? Was this dialogue and openness of key importance here? Remember about hierarchy of values? Or maybe something else was of key importance for John Paul II and his wisdom? And the second question, also to Professor Butylione. The second question was liberation theology. Is it a historical notion only, or perhaps, Professor, you can see that there are also elements of liberation theology today, not only of the left-hand side of the political spectrum? And one more from Priest Stęchły, a general question. What would be the message maybe of John Paul II today to the priests when faced with the pandemic? Maybe he would say, do not build my statues, new statues, but think about something else in the face of the pandemic. Professor, would you like to answer the questions that have been posed?
To understand John Paul II, I dare say, first we might, or we rather should, begin with 3 things. The first thing is the Holy Trinity. Holy Trinity, something that reflects the communal nature of a human being, how certain processes are initiated. The Archbishop touched upon that. The initiation. What's the risk today? Because the thing is, Christians, rather than initiate certain processes, might choose something else. I love you, I want to share my fate with you. And in Europe, we have many people that are not sharing this message of love. Many people are not filled with love. But you know, when you say, I love you, I want to create a community with you, we are starting a process. So we need to interact with other people. What I find troubling is that there are many people here in Poland and in other countries who, rather than initiating processes, they are afraid of the other people. They are afraid of their neighbor. They are afraid of the dialogue. They want to fence off, and they stay within the comfort of their own space, which is human, which is normal. Even animals do that. We defend our own territory. It's an instinctual reaction. It is animalistic. However, there are those animal-like elements in our national identity, which is also good, but we can defend them, but we can defend them only in our rapport with other people. When we isolate ourselves, this part of our identity will be lost. We will hurt others and ourselves as well. The third thing that I would like to discuss to respond to those questions, it is not all that closely linked to John Paul II, but it is more closely linked to the current pontiff, Pope Francis. No, I will discuss John Paul II, but Pope actually develops that thought. What we need is politics. We do need politics. Your Excellency, apologies, but the Church needs to do politics, but it needs to be their own politics. What is the Church's politics? It should be constitutional in nature. People need to be brought together so that communities are built. A nation is not a thing. It's not an artifact. A nation is a process. It is something that keeps happening and will continue to happening as long as there are people who want to meet other people so that bonds are set up. And then a national and then an international community is formed. As long as we think in this way, we are not afraid of others. Remember what the Pope said. Do not be afraid. Fear not. We are a small community, and so be it. Our faith and our opening up does not stem from our strength or ability to organize and control space. Our faith and our ability rests with Jesus Christ. He creates that community, and together with him and thanks to him, we can actually create that community. If Europe is less Christian than before, so be it. Maybe tomorrow things will change. Maybe tomorrow Europe will regain its more Christian nature if we follow in the footsteps of Christ. That's the most important thing in Europe. And it can be also heard in the latest encyclical of Pope Francis, Better Politics. There's a whole chapter dedicated to this theological reflection, but also to some postulates put forward to the politicians. A political encyclical, yes, but it's a different kind of politics. Carl Schmitt dominates politics today. Some people don't know who he was, and many people didn't read him, but they assimilated his concepts nevertheless. So the politics as this constant striving to destroy your foes. You know, the Pope says we have no foes. We might have antagonists, but we don't have foes. We want to work with our antagonists for the common good, for greater good. And somehow it all disappeared because politics is concentrated on attacking your foes, your enemies. And that's the type of political message of the church that I'm talking about. People need to find their own views, including political views, but it is communal in nature. I totally agree with Rocco Buttiglione when he speaks about openness. John Paul II was the embodiment of freedom and openness. Look at Germany. The German Catholic Church, if it were to become a national church, it would no longer be my church because Catholic means open. So there was this question asked by one of the online followers. Maybe she wanted to say that he would like to have fewer monuments and more mercy. By all means. Well, we need monuments to remember him. But when you see this monument, you need to know what the Pope spoke for. It might have been sensible patriotism or remembering your past, but at the same time about this country being a part of a greater whole of Europe and the world. It is an important task in this day and age, the age of pandemic. Because we should not be digging trenches that divide us. We should not give in to this temptation. It's a common problem and requires common solutions, global solutions even. In the German national anthem, there were those words, Deutschland über alles. Sounds a bit like America first. You know, this part of the anthem has been removed. The British say right or wrong, my country. Whatever happens, my country comes first. No, it's about values. So I mentioned this book today, and there I read how John Paul II describes various political systems, monarchy, anarchy, democracy, and he clearly favors democracy. And in the Catholic Church, it was not always all that obvious. So you have a nation, you have a group, and they all enjoyed a certain dignity. So the dignity of a person is the key to the Christian faith. So this dignity of a person that leads to openness and tolerance. It is not about accepting everybody who would like to come here from Africa or Asia. But we need to be open nevertheless. The refugees, people that are oppressed, you know, some of those people may arrive here, then they will return back to their countries, because we need to keep in mind their dignity. It's not about ourselves. I agree with Rocco Buttiglione here. We are people, we are persons, so we have personal responsibility for what we do, but also for other people. That's what solidarity is about. So, to follow up on what you said, President Petering, think about the thoughts of John Paul II. Is there anything there that resonates in this current discussion in Germany about the church? There we see things that are about the synodal road and renewal of the church. Are there any German Catholic milieus that directly point to the heritage of John Paul II? Is it something that is still relevant and vibrant in the German church? Thank you, Father Kazimierz, for this difficult question. I do not know what John Paul II's view would be today. But the core was openness and dialogue. So, if it were to be the case, he would speak for those new forms of participation by means of a synod or any other way. As I said, to him, human dignity came first. And I'm saying that as a regular believer, member of the church. You know, the church is not only about the hierarchy, you know, and there are no saints here, because to be a saint you need to go to this better place. I'm laughing because we've already discussed that, but I want to be indiscreet here. So openness. What is a lesson that I can see here in the context of John Paul II's thought? 1965. This beautiful letter of the Polish bishops to German bishops. Mind you, the German episcopate did not respond terribly quickly to that. In the Christian spirit, we forgive and we ask for forgiveness. There's this huge depth in this sentence. John Paul II at the time was the Metropolitan Bishop in Kraków, and I believe that there is his hand there in it somewhere. I don't want to make it too personal, but there are people who declare themselves as Catholics and they are politically accountable, and those people do not think in terms of dialogue, but they think in terms of resentments. And let us remember, I was born in 1945, so I remember about the German crimes, but I am not directly responsible for what happened back then. But nevertheless, such things as Auschwitz cannot be forgotten, which is why we build this House of European History in Brussels. But you cannot look at the world today only through the prism of those events. You cannot use it as an instrument to divide, to fence off, and to have immediate interests, to gain immediate interests. Openness, but also in the world of political community. So, let us move to Trnava, to Father Michał Lichner. Father Professor, may I ask you, let me paraphrase one of those questions here. What would be the message from John Paul II today? What would be his message to the current church of this day and age? Or maybe there is something that we can read anew, differently than we did when he was still alive and he was still a pope.
For this question, they are not very easy questions. I think the most important is to read the story of John Paul II with previous and today's papal teachings. Because what I see now, I can see maybe in Slovakia and also in other countries, we have a problem with the magisterium. We have many believers and they say if the Pope says, I like this, so this is a true Pope, a good Pope, a saint Pope. And if somebody says, or if the Pope says, I don't like, so it is not a good Pope. And I see this in many countries, mainly there are some very conservative people, they don't admit the teaching of the Pope Francis. And they don't say it, but they think that they are the magisterium. But if they deny the magisterium of the Pope Francis, they deny also the teaching of Saint John Paul II, because what is saying Pope Francis is the same as said Pope Benedict XVI and the Pope John Paul II. So there is a one line of a social Catholic teaching, of a spirituality, and so on and so on. So what we can learn is fidelity to the Pope. I think this is a very important point. I say this also because I am a Jesuit, and we have this 4 vow of the obedience of the Pope. But in this time of crisis, and Europe is crisis during the 2000 years, there is another time when the Europe was not in the crisis. So the spiritual renewal and the fidelity to the Pope, for me, in this time, because I'm a theologian, this is the most important.
I believe this is an interesting reflection. There is always an ongoing crisis that accompanies us. It is not so that we could say it's all very well and fine, thank you very much. We can never simply rest. There are always challenges ahead. One of those challenges is the time of pandemic. We had a question from one of the online followers. Yesterday, during the debate, we heard about how churches react to the current affairs, which direction they should choose, how they should react in the face of this crisis. But let us return to, mind you, I'm addressing Archbishop Ryś. Let us return to the heritage of John Paul II. So in 20 years' time, it may be easier to look back on those things. By all means, it's justified. But maybe also the Pope, being a saint and a historical figure, he was put on a pedestal. I'm talking about this Polish experience, and both Professor Butiliona and President Petering mentioned that, rediscovering inspiration in his thought and interpersonal relations. It's of great importance. I believe that today what dominates is looking at the Pope either as a historical figure or as a saint. What you mentioned, Father, are initiatives that still exist, that survive the World Youth Day, and how the Pope was focused on the young people. Let's look at the studies of religiosity performed by Pew Research Institute last year. They show that Poland is one of the 2 countries that are turning the most towards laicite, away from religion. And, dozens of countries were covered by the study, including the US, and Eurasia was included there too. 2 categories were studied. First, a response to moral obligations. And in Poland, you had the biggest number of naysayers. And secondly, it's about the generation. Poles are the most likely to give up religious practices, including the Holy Mass on Sunday. I'm not going to speak on behalf of all the clergy, but recently I had this discussion with somebody. What the world is like a few months into the pandemic. The answer is the same. 40 to 50% of people returned. When it comes to young people, the young generation, 30-year-olds, they are not there, practically speaking. And mind you, I am generalizing to a certain extent, but maybe initiatives are there in niche environments, but this enthusiastic message of John Paul II, flew over our heads. We missed it, Father Bishop. And I do not mean initiatives that gather thousands of young people when they are meeting Archbishop Ryś, because when he's there, crowds flock to meet him, that's for sure.
Well, I believe that what the pandemic has shown us is that there is a need for individual work. What is more, those opportunities for individual work, perhaps in some cases, in some circumstances, it was the only possible work. When we had the limit of 5 participants in the Eucharist in Poland, then you had the choice: either you do nothing, or perhaps you confirm one person, just one individual. I understand you did it, Bishop. I'm not mentioning it because I had this approach, but this is, I think, a confirmation of what John Paul II spoke about. This was later confirmed by Benedict and Francis in evangelization, and the subject is a person, human person. Evangelization is about a meeting, interpersonal meeting, person to person, direct meeting. If there is no experience of this personal faith, then ideology is replacing faith. Delibaki and others during the synod expressed this view. And if not ideology, we've recently discussed it in Łódź. What are the sources or reasons why many of people have not returned to churches? We thought that maybe we were looking at those in churches, but this was not faith, but it was a cultural, simply instinct. People have been doing what they've been doing for generations without faith. And again, this cultural habit is not equal to tradition, faith in tradition. Faith from tradition is a very serious threat. Faith that I've received from my parents, grandparents, and I accept this faith of generations as my own, while a cultural habit is something different. For instance, I go to church on Sunday. This is a habit, part of culture. Others go to church, I go to church, but there is no deep faith related. So now, if there is a difficult time, as the current months of pandemics, then those cultural habits are not strong enough, perhaps, to make people return to practice and return to churches and participate in the Eucharist. And this shows, I think, to us how important this everyday evangelization is, and how important it is, focused on individuals. When we read John Paul II more, I think we will be a happy church, developing church, growing church. We will not be shrinking, but we will be growing if we follow the ideas of John Paul II. We have to remember about this personal relationship. And now the problem of the young generation, probably, and well, this is our fault, not the fault of the young generation. This is the fault of the older generations. It's my fault, it's your fault. Not, again, I stress, the fault of the young people. The fault is that it's difficult for the young people to experience personal meeting with Jesus Christ. And if they do not have this experience of personal meeting, personal communion with Jesus Christ, if they do not have it, they will be staying out of church. It's only when they receive this experience of personal meeting with Jesus Christ, they will change perhaps their thinking about morality, about ethics. Then as persons, they will gather together in communities. I have no doubt about that. So this dimension is very important. John Paul II, I think, can help us, but I would be in favor of something that has been said here already, that we have to read John Paul II in the way that the Church does it, reading also the words of Benedict XVI, also Pope Francis. We should not just say, well, the history of Church, you might have the impression that the history of Church in Poland ended in 2005. This was not the end of the Church and its history in Poland. We have to read the words of John Paul II, but let us remember about Pope Benedict, Pope Francis as well. There are new challenges, new generations facing new challenges. The history continues. I wouldn't like us to read words of John Paul II only. This is not good, in my view, very clearly. And summing up now, it is my feeling that perhaps the greatest problem is that we are not reading any of them. We are not reading John Paul II, we're not reading Benedict, we're not reading Francis, we just read tweets maybe on them. all we read basically are just a few articles maybe on Pope Francis, on John Paul II, or on Benedict. They themselves are not sources of our inspiration. We don't read their words. This is, I think, a serious threat. Yes, I admit this is a threat perhaps facing us. The Pope says as authorities, but in life, in public life, I think you can say in general that if you stay within a bubble of social media and read social media only, you seem to be in touch with others, but you isolate yourself actually from the outside world. I think Pope Francis, in the recent encyclical, in point I think 41 or 42, he mentions social media. Sometimes they are a source of alienation actually, because people are isolated from the real world in social media. Can I ask still a question directed to our guest from Belarus, Volha Kawalkova? I'm very much interested from your perspective. Someone so important for Poles, John Paul II, like a statue person, so important for us in Poland. The Pope was, in a way, perhaps, the voice of different nations of Central and Eastern Europe. I'm wondering, your perspective from Belarus, what is your approach in Belarus to John Paul II? Is he still remembered in Belarus, or is he simply someone that maybe was limited only to Roman Catholics? Because we know Belarus is also divided between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. What was the role of John Paul II and many, of course, non-believers in Belarus? From your perspective, what is the view of young people, young generation in Belarus on John Paul II and his heritage? Well, I'm Orthodox. I want to make it clear from the beginning. The way I see it now is that maybe John Paul II plays a role in Belarus for Roman Catholics, but not really for the whole society. There are some fairly active communities, Christian communities, be it Roman Catholic or Orthodox communities that follow Jesus Christ. I think John Paul II is remembered mainly among the Catholics. In Belarus, we have some discussion about politics and Christianity. Sometimes I hear such discussions among the Orthodox. Again, as I said, I am Orthodox. We believe that Christians need to participate in the political life of our country. We have responsibilities. We have to be part of the social processes, because if we are not part of the political world, others will replace us with other perhaps views, values and principles. So in my view, we as Christians have a role to play in the political world. This is most important for me, this approach. This is the message I think we should be sending to all Christians, that we have to be active. And as for the voice of the churches, for instance, now during the recent events in Belarus, the Catholic Church was often supporting those protesting. The bells were rung, they could be heard. And now the authorities in Belarus are trying to limit the influence of the church. The Metropolitan of the Roman Catholic Church is banned from visiting Belarus at the moment. The Metropolitan of the Orthodox Church was against an active role of the church. Now there is a new Orthodox Metropolitan, and again I stress it, we have to be active. I think Europe has for a long time known that all Catholics and Orthodox believers need to be active in the social life. We are just learning it. What brings us together is Christianity as a whole. Christianity open to everyone. We are all Christians. I think we all should understand that we have to again be active in life. Well, for me, from my experience, I must say that it's not easy for Christians, I admit, to be active. Our values are not always represented in the political life. We always say that our life is based on the Ten Commandments and the text of the Gospel, but at the same time, of course, we understand that there may be some principles that not everyone agrees to. But we as Christians, we want to show that we act according to Christian principles. Christian in politics, sometimes I admit, the life in politics is not easy. With Christian democracy, for me, is a certain form of action. In the face of populism, very often we have to act. We as Christians also have to show. We do not speak only, but we act. We have to clearly show, because populists, they speak, they do not act. And we as Christians, I think we have to be engaged. We have to act and do exactly as the gospel shows us. Thank you very much. If you agree, I would like still to ask a question directed to Professor Buttiglione and Dr. Petering. What does it mean to be a Christian Democrat in Europe today? What is your approach? Well, in my view, there is nothing like Christian politics. No politician that is Christian should say that this is the truth in politics. This is the only possible answer. I'm convinced that you cannot speak about Christian politics. You should speak about politics based on Christian responsibility. And this, for me, means that we have to recognize the dignity of each individual. And when so, if you agree, I would like to quote priest Jerzy Popiełuszko again. In his preaching, he was showing the situation, the spirit in Poland in 1980s, early 80s. I agree also with what Archbishop Ryś said. The Catholic Church should not reduce itself to the teaching of one pope only. There were, of course, better and darker times in history. Yes, we admit dark periods of the Church also. One of the biggest mistakes, perhaps, in the development of the Catholic Church was that it exercised its power as a state, country almost. Not spiritual power, but power on governing here. But I think we have to draw on the spiritual power, spiritual resources, and again, Cesare Sacconi, I think Professor Buttiglione knows him very well, the book about Jerzy Popiełuszko, and here I'm quoting Jerzy Popiełuszko, Polish priest, after the visit of John Paul II in June '83, just a few days later. Priest Popiełuszko, about a year before he was murdered, he said, I quote, this is a quote from his sermons: in the dark night that governs in this country, there is a light of God's grace in the person of Pope John Paul II. He has visited as envoy of peace to our country. So this is the light that has been lit above our country, the dark days, the suffering of people, the tragical suffering of people over the years, the attempts to nullify human dignity, to make it impossible for young generation to have an optimistic future. So I think it's us in our faith in Poland, over the history of Poland, over 1,000 years, we have to act together. We have to think about the future of our country. We want to think already today about what we are going to do, what will remain from those ideas, and what we will use as food for thought. This was the situation in the dark years in this part of Europe at that time, and these were the ideas presented by Reverend Popiełuszko. referring and drawing on this spiritual strength. This strength would not be there had it not been for Pope John Paul II. So in my view, for my generation, from the perspective of Germany, my generation, I'm very much grateful for this contribution, the whole heritage of John Paul II. I think we all in Europe should always remember that this spiritual strength, this foundation, spiritual foundation is there, that has been created, that clearly shows what we have in common, we all in Europe, that we should all be fighting together for this foundation, so that authoritarian dictatorships do not govern the world as it does in Belarus, but we need to have strength to protect our values. So for that we need this strength, spiritual strength, but also political strength, so that we can fight for our values in the contemporary world. Rocco Buttiglione, the same question for you, if I may. The idea of the Christian democracy, it goes back to Leon XIII. He was convinced that in democracy without Christian values will be very quickly corrupted. The trust to the institutions, human trust to institutions might be violated, and the nation might be ready to accept tyranny without Christian values. So it is the task of the Christian democracy to create democracy that is based on values. This was the idea. However, let us stress the word democracy, not to impose any values by an absolutist government or totalitarian regime, but values that are personified by a life nation, life society. So again, initiating certain processes. I think that the current situation is very much similar. There's a crisis of the Western democracy. Maybe the crisis is deeper felt in the United States than in Europe. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right. Politics, the world of politics is very much about destroying your opponent, your enemy. Christian Democrats should be those who put the common good in the very center, and those who are able to debate with their adversaries using arguments. I used to be a friend of Helmut Kohl. I remember we walked together along the Rhine. Walking along the river, we had many interesting discussions. We spoke standard German, but when he met a local, Kohl spoke a German dialect. I was not able to understand what he was saying at all. He was very much rooted in his local Heimat. He understood local people, but he was not a populist, certainly. He understood simply local people, and he had this complex culture, complex heritage. He knew how to speak to people and how to look for answers, not to say yes to whatever others say, his adversaries or his friends, but he was simply a man from the folk, from the popular world. But he was someone who created a unity, a very special unity of the nation. We need People's Party, not only Christian democratic parties, also we need certainly socialist parties, social democratic parties, but we need parties based in people, in their views, that those will be able also to take over educational missions. Christian Democrats, in my view, need to have this ability to represent people. Thank you. I think that popularismo, I think this division is very important. Priest Sturzo discussed it, Pope Francis among others, and others discussed it very often. Also the Christian Democrats and Pope spoke on this. The Pope very clearly made this difference very important. In Italian there's a play on word. Populism is about words only very often, but we have to reach deep sometimes to wisdom, how shall I call it, courage also perhaps that ordinary people have. Populists instrumentalize the people, those that want to be part of this populare, they want to serve. Thank you very much. Yes, we found it interesting as Dr. Petering quoted Jerzy Popiełuszko. I thought at that time about the words of Max Weber. He wrote that only those societies developed, those that have brave, courageous kings, and those that tell kings what they should do, prophets in other words. I think John Paul II can be called a prophet for Europe, not only for Poland, countries of the region, but for the whole continent, maybe for the whole world. John Paul II's voice was the voice of a prophet who showed new directions, new ways in which our thinking can develop. I think the world has changed a lot during the pontificate of John Paul II, and Europe, as we see it today, was able to reconcile, come together. Archbishop Ryś spoke about New Europe. So it's not the whole process is not about adding something to a construction that was finished, but it's about building Europe anew, thinking it over. A special task, perhaps, a new task for politicians today, a task for the church also, the hierarchy, especially of the church. But also, first of all, this is a big task, I think, for all of us who consider ourselves Christian. I would like to thank all participants for participating in this discussion. Let me remind you, Volha Kowalkova was with us from Belarus, Valentina Alazraki from Mexico, Archbishop Grzegorz Ryś, Harsgard Petering, former President of the European Parliament, Rocco Buttiglione, and Professor Miloš Lichner. Thank you very much for being with us. Time to sum up our discussion. Rector of the Pontifical University, Professor Tira.
I believe that Bishop Pieronek is with us in spirit. His chair is still here. I believe he would be proud of us. So his work continues, and his trusted friends following his footsteps. This is the 20th conference. It's coming to an end, and important questions were asked about the Church and its role in Europe. These questions are somewhat disquieting, but they make us think. The Church plays an important role. The Church always acts on behalf of Christ, its founder, and to look for solutions to help those in need, to connect people, and to make people meet God. Everybody who lives in this old continent of ours. The Church continues to be a sign to those who live here, and its voice may not always be spoken, but it's acted out, and it's very important. Now, possibly ever more than before. John Paul II has its own special place in this conference. He approached everybody with courage, and he wrote about Europe in one of his exhortations. It was 17 years ago. It was a result of 2 debates in the early 90s, and then at the beginning of this century he wrote words that are still very much important. What is needed here in Europe is for an increase of a certain awareness, namely the awareness of its spiritual inheritance. For that to happen, we need to listen again and again Christ's gospel. That is why the Church feels that it needs to proclaim this message of hope that's been entrusted to it by God. So, yet again, I repeat to you, Europe. Europe, at the beginning of the third millennium. Be yourself again. Be yourself. Rediscover where you come from. Renew your roots. Throughout the ages, you have received this treasure of the Christian faith, and the foundation of your social life is gospel, and you can see the traces thereof in literature and art, in the thoughts of your nations. This inheritance, though, does not belong entirely with the past. It's an agenda for the future. It needs to be passed on to the coming generations, as it is a source of life for people and nations that jointly will be shaping the European continent. These words are truly powerful at the end. Do not be afraid. Gospel is not against you. It sides with you. So we are celebrating this 20th anniversary in a difficult time. We regret that we could not meet in person those who have been with us for such a long time. When we were initially planning this conference, we wanted to have a huge celebration, but the pandemic made us change our plans. We were following the statistical data provided by the ministry, and that made us limit the participation in this conference even further. And yet, let me thank all of those who made this conference possible. The main partners of our university, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Robert Schuman Foundation in Luxembourg, the Parliament Group, the EPP, and the Commission, Comache, and Wokół Nas, a publishing house. Thank you to the organizing committee headed by the honorary president, Cardinal Stanisław Dziwisz, Rafał Budnik, Oberberg, Michał Góra, and Hanna Dmowska, and Małgorzata Chudzio. Thank you for all those months of hard work that you put into the preparation of this event. This has been a Jubilee conference, and In Veritate award has been presented to a great personal friend of John Paul II and of Poles, Professor Rocco Buttiglione. And I thank you to the mayor of the city of Kraków, Professor Jacek Majchrowski, because he agreed to be an honorary patron of this conference. Thank you for your kind hospitality in Sokiennice, the cloth hall. Thank you to the marshal, Witold Kozłowski, for his work on the preparation of this special session dedicated to John Paul II. Without your work, this Jubilee conference would never have been possible. Thank you to Father Machniak, a parish priest of these Peter and Paul's Church, and thank you for this beautiful liturgy yesterday. And we were there next to the grave of Bishop Pieronek. And thank you for the Ordinary of Gliwice for his homily. Thank you to all the speakers and moderators who moderated this lively discussion. I deeply believe that we have food for thought for many months to come. And thank you to all those who followed us online. And finally, thank you to the heads of this center. Thank you to everybody for everything, in other words. And Once more, let me quote John Paul II. When an event would come to an end, he would say, "They will return. May it happen." And on behalf of the Pontifical University and all the other organizers and co-organizers, I would like to invite you to this 21st conference. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you good health, everyone. Thank you.